The lawyer's office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, the kind of smell that clings to places where fortunes are decided and futures are sealed. Elara Voss sat in a straight-back chair across from a man she had never met in a town she had only passed through once, holding a small canvas bag on her lap, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. It was not precious. It contained a change of clothes, a bar of soap, a worn book that had belonged to her mother, and a carving knife with a handle made from applewood, dark and smooth from years of use. That was everything she owned. She was 19 years old. She had signed the deed 3 days earlier with Augusta Fitch, the land agent's wife, who had the authority to witness transfers in her husband's absence. This office visit was the final step, the county notarization that made the transfer permanent under territorial law. She had walked to the county seat because there was no other way to get there that did not cost money she did not have. It had taken 4 days. Her boots had a hole in the left sole that she had patched twice, with strips of leather cut from an old belt, and the patch had held, which she took as a sign that some things in this world could be repaired if you had the patience and the right material. The man behind the desk reviewed the deed with the slow deliberateness of someone who charged by the hour. He was not unkind, but he was not warm either. He was a man of documents, and documents did not require warmth. He looked up over his spectacles. $12, he said, for 5 acres in a stone cabin. Yes, Elara said. You understand the property has been unoccupied for 10 years. I understand. And you have the $12. She had counted it out on Fitch's counter 6 days earlier. It was the last money she had in the world, earned over 2 years of mending clothes and washing linens for neighbors in the small town of Harwick, where she had grown up, where her father still lived, where she no longer had a home. She had carried those $12 in a small cloth pouch sewn into the lining of her coat, next to her skin, all the way from Harwick to Whisper Creek Valley, 4 days on mountain roads that climbed into country so wild and silent, it felt like the edge of the known world. I have it, she said. The man stamped the deed, signed his name, and slid it across the desk. Elara folded it carefully and put it inside her coat next to the empty pouch. She thanked him, picked up her bag, and walked out into the September afternoon. The sun was already low over the western peaks, turning the sky the color of embers. She stood on the wooden sidewalk of the county seat's single main street and looked at the mountains rising to the north, blue and enormous, and she felt something settle inside her chest. Not happiness exactly, not relief, something quieter than either of those. A kind of stillness that comes when a decision has been made and cannot be unmade, and you find to your own surprise that you are not sorry. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and began the long walk back. To understand why Elara Voss was walking alone through the Colorado mountains in the autumn of 1888 with a deed to a ruined cabin and nothing else of material value, you had to go back 10 years to a house in Harwick that had once smelled of baked bread and wildflowers, and the particular warmth of a woman who knew how to make a home feel inhabited. Her mother, Clara, had been that kind of woman. She had a way of moving through a house that made every room feel like the center of something. She taught Elara the names of the stars visible from their back porch, the difference between the calls of a meadowlark and a vesper sparrow, the way to read the color of the evening sky for the next day's weather. She was 31 years old when the fever took her in the autumn of Elara's 9th year, and the house in Harwick went quiet in a way that was not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of a particular kind of warmth that Elara would spend years trying to find again in other places and other people. Her father, Robert Voss, was a decent man undone by grief. He had loved Clara completely and without reservation, and when she was gone, he found himself standing in a house full of her things and her absence, and a 9-year-old daughter who had her mother's eyes. He retreated into his work at the mill and left the managing of the household to Habit, and then 2 years later to a woman named Dorothea Creel, who he married in a quiet ceremony that Elara was not told about until it was done. Dorothea Creel was not a cruel woman. She was something harder to name and in some ways harder to bear. She saw the world as a ledger, every action an entry to be recorded, every relationship a transaction to be balanced. She ran the house with the efficiency of someone who had never confused a home with a place of warmth. She fed Alara, clothed her, ensured she attended school. She fulfilled every obligation that could be written down. She fulfilled none of the ones that could not. She looked at Alara the way a woman looks at a responsibility she had not asked for and did not intend to exceed. Robert Voss saw none of this, or saw it and told himself it was not what it appeared to be, or saw it and found that looking away was easier than whatever the alternative required. He was not a bad man. He was a weak one. And in the years that followed, Alara came to understand that weakness can do as much damage as cruelty, sometimes more, because it is harder to name and therefore harder to protect yourself against. She might have grown up entirely alone inside that quiet transactional house had it not been for the man who lived next door. Silas Holt was 68 years old when Alara first began to notice him. Though he had been there her whole life, a constant presence at the edges of her childhood, like a weathered fence post that had always been part of the landscape. He was a carpenter and a widower, a man who had outlived his wife by 15 years and his only son by 10, and who had responded to those losses by turning himself entirely toward his work. His workshop sat at the edge of his property, its wide doors always open in good weather, exhaling the warm, complicated smell of sawdust and linseed oil, and something older and more mineral, the smell of wood giving itself over to human intention. He was not a sociable man. He did not wave from his porch or linger at the fence to talk, but he saw things. That was his particular gift, or perhaps his particular discipline. He looked at the world with the same attention he gave to a piece of lumber he was considering for a joint, slowly, methodically noting the grain and the weight and the potential hidden in the material. He saw Alara. She was 9 years old and newly motherless, and spending her afternoon sitting on the back steps of her father's house, watching the sky change color over the mountains, when she first noticed that the wide doors of Silas Holt's workshop were open and that there was something inside worth looking at. She crept closer over several days the way a cautious animal approaches a place that smells interesting but unfamiliar. She stood at the edge of his property and watched him work. He moved with the slow certainty of someone who had learned long ago that hurrying a piece of wood produces only firewood. He never acknowledged her presence. He never told her to go away. One afternoon, she arrived at her customary watching spot to find a small block of soft pine and a whittling knife sitting on a stump just inside the workshop door. Not in front of the door. Inside it, just past the threshold, as though they had been placed there by accident or by someone who had not thought carefully about where they were setting things down. Alara stood and looked at the block and the knife for a long time. Then she stepped inside and picked them up. Silas Holt, working at his bench with his back to her, did not turn around. He made no acknowledgement. He simply continued planing the edge of a long piece of walnut with the slow, rhythmic strokes that produced every few passes a thin, curling shaving that fell to the floor like a question mark. She sat on the stump and began to whittle. She had no idea what she was doing. She cut herself twice in the first 10 minutes, minor cuts that stung and bled a little. She said nothing. Silas said nothing. She kept working. That was how it began. Over the years that followed, the workshop became the only place in Alara's world where she felt entirely herself. She came every day after school, every Saturday morning, every free hour she could extract from the obligations of the house. Silas never gave formal lessons. He taught entirely by demonstration, by proximity, by the occasional correction of her grip on a tool, or the angle of her cut communicated through a touch on the wrist or a slow shake of the head. He showed her how to read the grain of a board, not by explaining the concept, but by running her fingers along a piece of oak until she could feel the difference herself. He demonstrated the sound a handsaw makes in maple versus pine, the higher pitch of the denser wood, and waited until she could hear the distinction without prompting. He taught her masonry too, because a good builder, he showed her without saying so, needed to understand every material a structure might require. He showed her how to mix lime mortar, not with a recipe, but with a feel for the consistency, the way it should cling to the back of the trowel without running the color it turned when it was ready. He taught her how to read a river stone for its load-bearing face, how to fit two stones together so they would hold each other through frost and heat, and the long, slow movement of the earth. He taught her how a properly set foundation distributes weight, not downward only but outward, pressing into the ground with a patience that outlasts everything built on top of it. She was not a prodigy. She made mistakes, sometimes costly ones, ruining pieces of good wood, mixing mortar too thin or too stiff, cutting joints that fit poorly and had to be done again. Silas never expressed frustration. He simply showed her where the mistake was and moved on. She came to understand that mistakes were not failures in his workshop. They were information. The wood was always trying to tell you something. Your job was to learn to listen. She learned to listen. By the time she was 12, she could hang a door so true it would stop exactly where you left it without drifting. By 14, she could mix a batch of mortar by feel in the dark and have it come out right. By 16, she could select a piece of timber for a structural joint with the same unhurried confidence Silas brought to everything, reading the grain, testing the weight, understanding what the material would do under load over time. On her 16th birthday, she arrived at the workshop to find Silas standing at his bench with a small object in his hand. He held it out to her without preamble or ceremony. It was a carving knife. The blade was fine Swedish steel ground to an edge so keen it could split a hair. The handle was carved from applewood, a piece from the old tree that grew in the corner of his yard, worn smooth and dark with linseed oil, shaped to fit a hand that was precisely her size. He had made it for her, not in the last few days. Over months, she realized later. The applewood had been seasoning on a shelf in the corner of his workshop for at least a year before the knife appeared in her hand. He had been planning this. He had been watching the shape of her hands, the way she held a tool, and he had made her something that fit. He said only a tool, not a trinket. She understood. It was not a gift for a birthday. It was a recognition. He was telling her in the only language he used with any fluency that he saw what she was becoming, that he trusted her with steel and the responsibility that came with it. She carried that knife every day from that moment forward. She wore it on her belt when she was working and in a sheath inside her coat when she was not. And the weight of it became so familiar that its absence would have felt wrong, in the way that the absence of a necessary part of a structure feels wrong, a gap where something load-bearing used to be. The 3 years between her 16th birthday and the morning she was put out of her father's house were the years in which she grew fully into the person she was going to be. She was not popular in Harwick. She was too quiet, too self-contained, too comfortable in the workshop, and too uncomfortable in the parlors where the other girls her age spent their afternoons. She did not particularly mind this. She had work she cared about, and a teacher she respected, and a growing sense of what she was capable of, which was the only social capital that mattered in Silas Holt's workshop. Outside it, she moved through the world of the house and the town with the patience of someone who understands that the circumstances you are in are not necessarily the circumstances you will always be in, and that the most useful thing you can do in the meantime is keep learning. She mended clothes for money because mending was another kind of repair work, and she was good at it, and the neighbors paid reliably. She washed linens for 2 families on Saturday mornings. She split wood for old Silas when his hands were stiff in cold weather, and repaired the fence between their properties when it blew down, and asked nothing for either because Silas had given her 10 years of the most valuable education she had ever received, and a knife that fit her hand perfectly, and she considered the debt unpayable regardless. She saved every dollar she earned in the cloth pouch sewn inside her coat. She did not know what she was saving for. She knew only that having money meant having options, and having options meant not being entirely at the mercy of other people's decisions about your life. That understanding would prove to be the most important thing she ever learned apart from everything Silas taught her. The morning she was put out of her father's house was a Tuesday in late September. She had spent the morning helping Silas repair a section of fence that had come down in a windstorm, and she had come home with the satisfying ache of outdoor work in her shoulders, smelling of split pine and fresh air. She found the front door locked. Her canvas bag was on the porch. A folded note was pinned to it with a straight pin, the kind Dorothea used for sewing. She recognized the handwriting before she unfolded the note. Sharp, upright letters, no flourishes, the handwriting of a woman who had decided long ago that sentiment was a form of imprecision. It said, Alara, you are 19, a woman grown, and it is past time you made your own way. Your father and I have done our duty by you. Your things are in this bag. We wish you no ill, but do not return here. It would be inconvenient. There was no signature. There was no word from her father. She looked through the front window. Robert Voss was sitting at the dining table, his back to the glass, bent over something on the table in front of him. He did not move. He did not turn. He was a man who had learned that if he looked away from a thing long enough, he could almost convince himself it was not there. Ilara stood on the porch for a long moment. She waited for something inside her to break open, for the grief or the rage or the tears that seemed like the appropriate response to being cast out of the only home you had ever known by a woman who had never wanted you there, while your father sat 10 feet away and did not turn around. She waited. Nothing broke open. There was only the cold stillness she had been carrying in her chest for years, which had grown so familiar by now that she recognized it as a kind of company. She folded the note and put it in her coat pocket. She unpinned it from the bag carefully because the pin was useful and she had nothing to waste. She lifted the canvas bag, which was light, and checked its contents. The change of clothes, the bar of soap, the book. She had not expected them to pack the book, her mother's book, a worn copy of a collection of poems that Clara Voss had loved and read aloud on winter evenings, and the fact that it was there struck Alara as the most unintentionally honest thing Dorothea Creel had ever done on her behalf. She reached into her coat and felt the handle of Silas's knife in its sheath, cool and smooth and entirely familiar shape to her hand. She did not draw it. She simply held it for a moment through the leather, feeling the weight and the shape of it, and then she shouldered the bag and walked toward the workshop next door. She did not go inside. She stood at the open door and looked at the old man working at his bench, the same posture she had first observed 10 years ago, from across the property line, the same slow and certain movement of his hands. He knew she was there. He always knew. He did not turn around for a long moment. Then he set down his plane very deliberately and turned to face her. He looked at her standing in the doorway with her canvas bag and the expression of someone who has made a decision that cannot be unmade. He looked at her the way he looked at a piece of wood before he began to work it with total attention, assessing the grain and the weight and the potential. He nodded once. That was all. It was enough. It was she understood everything. She turned and walked west. She did not look back. The road received her the way good roads do, without comment, simply continuing in the direction she needed to go. The mountains rose ahead of her, enormous and indifferent and entirely honest about what they were, which was a landscape that did not care whether she made it or not, and would be equally beautiful either way, and she found this strangely comforting. The mountains were not pretending to welcome her. They were simply there. She asked nothing more of them than that. She walked until the light failed that first day and slept in a barn whose owner she did not meet, burrowed into hay that smelled of summer long past. She walked through farmland going golden in the September turn, past homesteads whose wood smoke rose straight into the windless air, past small children who watched her from fence rails with the frank curiosity of people who have not yet learned that staring is considered rude. She bought bread and cheese at a crossroads store on the second day and made it last because she had learned from years of managing small resources that the discipline of making things last was its own kind of skill. On the third day, the farms gave way entirely to mountain country, the road narrowing to a track that wound through stands of pines so dense the sky was only visible in patches, the air thinning and sharpening with altitude until every breath felt more substantial than the one before it. She heard elk in the trees at dusk moving through the undergrowth with a heaviness that was audible but not visible. She heard the creek before she saw it, its voice carrying through the trees, and she followed the sound the way you follow any voice that seems to know where it is going. On the evening of the fourth day, she crested a high ridge and the valley opened below her. Whisper Creek Valley was a long green corridor between two ranges of mountains, a silver thread of water visible at its center, a small cluster of buildings at its near end, where the road descended from the ridge. The evening light was extraordinary, the kind of light that only exists in mountain country in autumn amber, and precise, laying itself across the valley floor in long shadows that pointed east like compass needles. She stood on the ridge for a long time and looked at it. Then she went down. Cornelius Fitch was not what she had expected from a land agent. He was an older man, deeply wrinkled, stooped, beneath a pair of suspenders that appeared to be doing significant structural work, with the particular kind of eyes that belong to people who have lived a long time in small communities and made it their business to know everything about everyone. He looked her over when she walked into his store, a single slow assessment from boots to face, and she returned the look with equal directness. She told him she was looking for land, something small and inexpensive. She had $12. He pulled a large ledger from under the counter and opened it with the deliberateness of a man who had done this same gesture thousands of times and had decided not to hurry it. He turned pages. He stopped. "There is one property," he said, "the Vance parcel, stone cabin 5 acres right on the creek." He paused. "It has been unoccupied for 10 years. "Why?" she asked. He took off his spectacles and polished them on his shirt, which was what he did. She would learn when he was deciding how much of the truth to tell. "Esther and Samuel Vance built the cabin in 1872, he said. "Good people, skilled. Samuel was the best stonemason in the county, maybe in the territory. They had a son, Daniel, who was a bright boy." He stopped. "The boy died of fever in the winter of 1877. He was 8 years old. The following spring, Samuel was killed in a rock slide at the old silver mine up the North Fork. Esther stayed on alone for another year. Then she left, just walked away one morning. Nobody ever saw her again." Alara was quiet for a moment. "And the cabin," Fitch put his spectacles back on. "People say it holds its grief. They call it the cursed cabin. 3 families tried to settle there after Esther left. None of them lasted a full season. Something always went wrong. A horse that threw its rider. A child who took sick. A fire in the outbuilding." He shrugged with the philosophical resignation of a man who has decided that some things in the world are beyond his professional purview. "The county put it in the books at $12 just to clear the title. Nobody's offered even that." "I'll take it," Ilara said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, some calculation or recognition, but he asked no questions. He called Augusta through from the back of the store because Fitch himself would be riding out to the north end of the valley and could not witness the transfer that afternoon, and Augusta Fitch had the legal authority to act in his absence. Augusta was a small woman with the kind of face that has been shaped by a lifetime of watching what other people do and deciding what she thinks about it. She looked at Alara once directly and then filled out the deed in a careful hand and pressed the county seal, and Alara counted $12 onto the counter coin by coin, the last money she had in the world. Alara would carry the deed to the county seat to be formally notarized, but the transfer was made. The cabin was hers. She found it a mile up the creek from the settlement at the end of an overgrown path where the trees pressed close on both sides and the sound of the water was constant. She came around a bend in the path, and there it was, set back in a clearing against a stand of tall ponderosa pines, and she stopped walking. It was a ruin. There was no other honest word for it. The sod roof had gone wild with grass and woody growth heavy enough to strain the ridge beam. One window was a black vacancy, the glass long gone. The heavy plank door hung from a single leather hinge canted sideways like a man who has lost his footing. The garden was a tangle of 10 years of unchecked growth, blackberry canes arching over what had been vegetable beds, their canes thick as a man's thumb. But the walls. The walls were something else entirely. They were built from river stones, large flat stones fitted together with the precision of a man who understood his material completely. The stones had been chosen for their faces fitted so that their broad surfaces lay outward, their weight pressing into each other with the logic of an arch. 10 years of mountain winters had done nothing to them. They sat as solid and exact as the day they were laid, each stone in conversation with the ones beside it, bearing weight and distributing it with the quiet intelligence of a well-designed system. Silas had shown her this. She could feel the echo of his instruction in her hands as she looked at the walls, the pressure of his palms steering her fingers to the right stone. The patient repetition of lessons she had absorbed so completely, they were no longer lessons, but knowledge. Feel the weight, find the face. Let the stone tell you where it wants to sit. She walked to the door and pushed it open. It resisted the single hinge straining, but it opened. Inside was dark and cool and thick with the smell of dust and old wood, and faintly under everything else, the ghost of old fires. The floor was packed earth, hard and smooth from years of use before the years of disuse. The sleeping loft above was intact, its ladder still standing against the wall, its rungs solid when she tested them. And at the back of the single room, taking up most of the wall, was the largest stone hearth she had ever seen outside of a commercial building. It was a magnificent piece of work. The firebox was deep and wide, framed by stones selected with obvious care for their color, and form fitted into an arch above the opening that was not merely structural but beautiful. The stones graduating in size from the keystone outward with a mason's precise eye for proportion. The man who had built this had not been satisfied with functional. He had wanted it to be worthy of the room it heated, worthy of the family it would warm. The hearthstone itself, the large flat slab that covered the floor of the firebox and the area immediately in front of it, was cracked. A fracture ran clear across it, diagonal, and the larger portion had settled several inches lower than the smaller, creating a dangerous lip where the two sections no longer met. 10 years without fire and tending had let the frost work into that crack, and the crack had become a gap wide enough to trap a foot. Alara stood in the doorway of the ruined cabin and looked at the magnificent broken hearth and felt the deep satisfaction of someone who has found exactly the work they are capable of doing. She put down her bag. She took off her coat, folded it, and set it on the cleanest patch of floor she could find. She rolled up her sleeves. She began. The first week was cleaning. She swept the accumulated debris of 10 years out of every corner, working from ceiling to floor, dislodging mouse nests and old bird roosts from the eaves of the loft, scraping the hardened deposits of seasons from the windowsills and the floor. She found a rusted iron kettle in a corner that was still sound, and she dragged it to the creek and scrubbed it with sand until it shed its rust and showed the dark iron beneath. And she boiled water in it for cleaning the worst of the accumulated grime from the walls and the surfaces. She repaired the door first because a door that hung properly was the difference between a structure and a shelter. She used Silas's knife to cut the remnant of the old leather hinge away cleanly, and she spent a full day and a half fashioning new hinges from strap iron she found at the abandoned mine, half a mile up the canyon, bending the metal cold over a stone anvil. She improvised from a flat river rock, drilling the bolt holes with a point she sharpened on the cabin's own stone walls. When she finally hung the door and pushed it open and let it swing free, and it moved without binding, stopping exactly where she left it, without drifting. She stood back and looked at it for a long moment with the particular satisfaction of a job that has been done to the standard it deserved. Then she went back to work. She patched the window opening with a frame of new pine she cut from a fallen tree at the edge of the clearing, careful to select wood that had been dead long enough to be dry, but not so long that it had begun to decay, reading the grain and the weight of each candidate piece, the way Silas had taught her. She bought a pane of glass from Fitch's store with the first dollar she earned mending shirts for Augusta, a task completed in an evening by the light of a stub of candle, her mother's book propped open on the table beside her, more for company than for reading. The chinking between the logs had crumbled away in dozens of places, leaving gaps that the wind found and used freely. She spent 3 days at the creek mixing clay and sand and dried grass into a slurry that smelled of the earth itself, working the mixture with her hands until it had the right consistency, tacky enough to key into the gaps without slumping. She packed it into every crack she could find, working systematically around the cabin from the base upward, and the first night after she finished, when the wind came down from the peaks after dark, as it did every night in this valley, the cabin was quiet in a way it had not been. She slept better than she had in years. She built furniture from salvaged timber, a table and two stools, and a bed frame in the loft using the joinery Silas had taught her, cutting mortise and tenon joints by hand with a chisel she had found in the mine debris and sharpened on a flat stone. The joints fit together without a single nail, held by the geometry of their own interlocking shapes. And when she set the table on the packed earth floor and tested it, pressing down on each corner in turn, it did not rock. She laid in a supply of firewood against the day she could safely use the hearth-splitting sections of a large dead pine near the clearing's edge into rounds and then quarters, and stacking them against the south wall of the cabin where the afternoon sun would finish drying them. She was patient about this. The hearth could not be rushed. It had to be done properly or not at all. She had been at Whisper Creek for 3 weeks when Cornelius Fitch's wife, Augusta, stopped her on the path to the settlement and said carefully, as someone says a thing they have decided to say, and then immediately wondered if they should have child. "I wonder if you know about Harlan Dodd." Elara said she did not. Augusta Fitch looked up the path and then down the path, and then at Elara with the expression of someone who has decided to be thorough about a thing they are already committed to. "Harlan Dodd is the wealthiest man in this valley," she said. "He owns the largest ranch, controls the water rights on the north end of the creek, and has been buying up land wherever he can for 15 years. He has been trying to acquire the Vance parcel for 10 of those years." She paused. "He has not succeeded because he did not want to pay even $12 for land he considered his by right. He preferred to wait. Every time a family tried to settle there and found it difficult, that was not the curse. Those were the consequences of Harlan Dodd's particular way of doing business." Elara was very still. "He drove them away. He made them unwelcome," Augusta said with precision. "He told people in town that the place was cursed, that anyone who stayed there was asking for trouble. He told them stories about the families who left. He made it so that nobody in this valley would do business with anyone trying to make a go of that property. He was patient. He has always been patient when patience is cheaper than paying." "Why are you telling me this?" Augusta Fitch looked at her for a moment. "Because you are 19 years old and you are here alone, and you put $12 on my counter and asked for a chance," she said. "And because I have watched Harlan Dodd take things from people for 15 years by wearing them down until they gave up, and I am tired of watching it." She turned and walked back toward the settlement without another word. Elara stood on the path for a long moment after she had gone. The creek moved past below her, clear and cold and unhurrying. A hawk turned in a wide circle over the valley, riding a thermal up the face of the eastern ridge. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, and the air smelled of pine resin and the first distant suggestion of coming cold. Harlan Dodd came to see her that same afternoon. He was not what she would have imagined if she had imagined him. He was a man in his mid-50s, well-built, with the kind of tan that comes from a lifetime outdoors, and the kind of suit that suggests someone who understands the value of appearance while not being entirely comfortable with it. He rode a good horse. He removed his hat when he reached the clearing and held it in front of him in a gesture that managed to suggest respect while communicating something entirely different. He was polite. He was measured. He spoke with the particular fluency of a man who has been persuading people of things for a long time and has refined his approach to something very close to an art form. He told her he admired her initiative. He told her the Vance cabin had sentimental value to him, that he had known Samuel Vance personally and wished to preserve the property in the family's memory. He told her he understood she had paid $12 for the deed and that he would be happy to offer her $200 to transfer it, enough money for a young woman to establish herself very comfortably in any town in Colorado. He told her all of this looking directly at her with the steady and apparently sincere attention of a man making a generous offer to someone he genuinely wished well. Elara listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "No, thank you." Something moved behind his eyes, a brief recalibration fast enough that someone less attentive might have missed it entirely. Then he smiled a practiced smile, the kind that means the conversation is over but not finished. "Consider it," he said. "My offer will remain open." He put his hat back on, turned his horse, and rode back down the path toward the valley without looking back. Alara watched him go. She thought about what Augusta had told her, and about the expression she had seen move behind Harlan Dodd's eyes when she said no. Not anger, not surprise. Something more like the adjustment of a mechanism smooth and internal, the recalibration of a man who has encountered an obstacle and is already computing the next approach. He had been patient for 10 years. He could afford to be patient longer. She thought so can I. 3 nights after Dodd's visit, she woke before dawn to a smell that should not have been there. Not the good smell of wood smoke from a controlled fire. The sharp, urgent smell of something burning that had not been lit on purpose. She was out of the loft and through the door in the time it took to pull on her boots, moving without the paralysis of someone who has never faced an emergency before moving the way Silas had trained her to move, when something demanded immediate physical response, assess, decide, act. The fire was at the back of the cabin against the north wall, where someone had piled dried brush and dead grass against the base logs and set it alight. The wall had not yet caught, but the brush was burning hard in the night wind that came down the canyon, and another minute or two would have brought the flames to the logs themselves. She grabbed the iron kettle from inside the door and ran to the creek and ran back and through the water and ran again. 4 trips. 5. The fire hissed and smoked and died, leaving a black smear against the base logs that would require inspection in daylight, but had not by the smallest of margins reached anything structural. She stood in the clearing in the cold dark afterward, breathing hard, and looked at the black smear and thought about what it meant. It meant Harlan Dodd had decided that waiting was no longer his preferred strategy. It meant the gracious offer and the patient smile had been the first move in a sequence, and this was the second, and there would be more. She went back inside. She did not sleep again that night. She sat by the small fire she built in the outdoor ring, the hearth still too dangerous to use until it was repaired, and she thought about what she knew and what she had to do. She thought he has resources and connections and 15 years of practice at this. He has money and patience and the sheriff of this county in his debt. She thought I have a deed that is legally sound, a cabin that is becoming livable, and 10 years of training in how to work with difficult materials. She thought a structure fails at its weakest joint. My job is to make sure I do not have any. She was 3 days away from discovering that the cabin had been waiting to help her do exactly that. The Hearthstone had been on her mind since the first day she walked into the cabin. October was arriving in the high country with the particular urgency of mountain seasons, the morning sharp and the afternoon short, and the smell of snow already present in the air that came down from the peaks after dark. She could not spend a Colorado winter in a cabin with no working fireplace. The hearth had to come first. She had spent the previous weeks earning money and acquiring materials. 3 more mending jobs for Augusta, 2 afternoons, splitting and stacking wood for an elderly man named Prescott at the north end of the settlement, whose hands had become too stiff for heavy work. A morning repairing a broken wagon wheel spoke for the Kerrigan family at the sawmill in exchange for a handful of good nails. She bought lime and sand from Fitch's supply shelves, a good cold chisel, and a stone hammer, and carried everything back to the cabin in 2 loads, stopping to rest on the ridge above the settlement where the view of the valley was best, and the pines stood so still in the windless morning they looked painted. The problem was the Hearthstone itself. It was a single slab of flat granite roughly 4 feet by 3.5 inches thick, and it weighed considerably more than she did. Moving it alone was not impossible. She had learned from Silas that very few things involving stone were truly impossible if you understood leverage and patience, but it would require the right approach and the right tools, and the willingness to fail several times before succeeding. She found a long, straight pine log near the edge of the clearing sound, and dry heavy enough for a lever bar. She shaped the end with her knife and the cold chisel to fit into the gap along the crack. She chose a rounded river stone for a fulcrum, placing it carefully at the point, that would give her the best mechanical advantage, testing the position 3 times before she was satisfied. She worked at it for 3 days. The first day she made no progress except to understand exactly how the stone was seated and where its weight was concentrated. This was not wasted time. Understanding the problem completely before attempting a solution was something Silas had shown her by example so many times it had become reflex. You did not force the material, you listened to it. The second day she got the smaller section to shift just barely, just enough to feel the whole slab flex as a unit rather than two independent pieces, which told her the fracture had not gone all the way through the compacted sand beneath. On the morning of the third day, she repositioned the fulcrum stone 2 inches to the left, changed the angle of the lever bar, set her feet against the packed earth, and pushed with everything she had. The slab moved. A grinding, reluctant soundstone against compacted sand, the long groan of something that had not shifted in a very long time. She pushed harder, her arms shaking her boots, finding what purchase they could. The slab lifted at the near edge slowly at first, and then with increasing speed as the leverage took hold, and then with a sound like a long exhale, it came fully free of its bed, and she had it balanced on the fulcrum stone, tipped at an angle, the underside exposed for the first time in at least 30 years. She held it there, breathing hard, her whole body trembling with the sustained effort. And there in the hollow in the sand, where the center of the stone had rested, was a package. She stared at it. Her arms were shaking, and her breath was loud in the quiet cabin, and she stared at the package for what was probably 5 seconds, but felt considerably longer. Then she carefully guided the Hearthstone down onto its side, away from the hollow, and lowered the lever bar. She sat back on her heels and looked. It was wrapped in oilskin, the good kind thick, and wax the color of old amber. It was roughly the size of a thick book tied with a length of tarred twine that had hardened to near rigidity with age. It had been placed in the hollow, deliberately centered in the space, with a care that was evident even after decades. This was not something dropped or forgotten. This was something placed with intention, with the same care that Samuel Vance had used to choose each stone for the arch above the firebox. She reached for it. It was heavier than its size suggested. She carried it to the doorway where the October light was stronger and set it on the threshold. She took out Silas's knife and cut the twine, carefully preserving the knot, and peeled back the oilskin in layers, the outer wrapping stiff and reluctant, the inner layers more supple until the last layer fell away and she was looking at what was inside. The coins were stacked in 2 neat columns, each one held in place by the tight wrapping of the oilskin. $20 gold pieces, their surfaces dulled but not corroded the particular way gold ages when it has been sealed from air for a long time. She counted them twice slowly. 9 coins, $180. Beneath the coins was a letter folded 4 times, the paper yellowed to the color of old cream. And beside the letter, resting in the hollow of the oilskin, was a small stone. It was smooth and dark, river polished, fitting perfectly in the palm of her hand when she picked it up, a stone of such particular shape and weight that she understood immediately it had been chosen and kept for exactly those qualities, the way a child chooses a stone from among thousands, because it is the right one and no other will do. She set the coins to one side. She unfolded the letter with the same care she had used to cut the twine, because the paper was old and the folds were brittle, and because something in the deliberateness with which it had been wrapped and placed told her it deserved that kind of attention. The handwriting was clear and steady, the hand of a woman who had been well educated and who had written this draft once before, writing it out final, getting every word right. It began, "To whoever finds this in this house I built with my husband Samuel. My name is Esther Vance. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has not gone as I had hoped." She had not moved from where she first opened the letter, sitting cross-legged on the floor near the doorway, with her back against the frame. She read, and the October sun moved past its noon angle and fell at a new slant across the packed earth, and she did not notice the cold coming into the threshold stone beneath her. She did not notice anything except the letter. Esther Vance had come to Whisper Creek Valley in the spring of 1872 with her husband Samuel and their son Daniel, who was 2 years old, and already his mother wrote, possessed of the particular stubbornness that in a boy looks like difficulty and in a man looks like character. Samuel was a stonemason trained in the old way, apprenticed at 14 to a master who had learned the trade from his own father, and he had looked at the river stones of Whisper Creek and said they were the finest he had ever worked with, stones shaped by the water into exactly the forms a builder needed, with flat faces and good weight, and the density that held heat in winter and stayed cool in summer. They had built the cabin together stone by stone and log by log, and Esther described the building in the letter with a specificity that Alara recognized as the specificity of someone who had done the work themselves and not merely watched it done. The hearth had taken Samuel 3 weeks by itself. He had laid the firebox stones dry, first testing each fit before mixing mortar, and he had chosen the keystone of the arch from 100 candidates before he found the one whose angles were exactly right. He was, Esther wrote, a man who believed that a thing built well enough lasted forever, and that lasting forever was worth any amount of extra time. For 5 years, the cabin had been a happy place. Daniel had grown into the valley with the ease of a child who has been given exactly the right amount of space and exactly the right amount of attention. His pockets were always full of things he had found: smooth stones, bird feathers, the shed skins of snakes, interesting pieces of bark. He had a favorite stone, a small dark river stone that fit perfectly in his palm, which he called his lucky stone and carried everywhere. The stone Alara held, now cool and perfectly weighted in her left hand. They had been saving money since before Daniel was born. Every extra dollar went into the fund that was for him, for his future, for the education and the wider life they wanted him to have. Samuel worked part-time at the silver mine up the North Fork, in addition to the stonemasonry work that came in steadily from the growing valley, and Esther sold butter and eggs and preserved goods to the settlement store and to the travelers who came through on the road. They kept the money in the most secure place Samuel knew, beneath the hearthstone of the fireplace he had built with his own hands under the heart of the home they had made together. Then the winter of 1877. The letter changed here. The handwriting remained steady, but the words became shorter, as though Esther had learned in the writing of this that some things must be said quickly or the hand will stop moving entirely. The fever came through the valley in December. Daniel had been sick before, and Esther had not been immediately alarmed. By the 3rd day, she was alarmed. By the 5th day, he was gone. He was 8 years old. She wrote, "The light went out of this house. I do not know how else to say it. We were 3, and then we were 2, and the 3rd was the one the house had been built around. And afterward, we were not a family anymore. We were just 2 people in a place where a child had lived." Samuel went back to the mine. He went back because there was nothing else to do, and because standing still in the cabin was something neither of them could bear. He became reckless in the way of a man who has decided that careful preservation of his own life is no longer his first priority. He took the jobs no one else would take. The unstable faces, the deep shafts where the timber supports were old, and the mountain's weight was a constant presence overhead. In the spring of 1878, there was a rock slide at the upper level. 3 men were injured. Samuel did not survive. Esther had stayed for a year after that. She stayed because leaving felt like abandoning the people she had been here with, like turning her back on every stone Samuel had chosen and fitted with such care, like betraying the valley that Daniel had loved and spent his days exploring. But the money beneath the hearthstone had become unbearable. It was Daniel's money saved for Daniel's future, and Daniel had no future anymore. And every time she looked at the hearth, she thought of the boy who should have been sitting in front of it. She could not spend it. It was not hers to spend. And so she had decided to leave it. She had packed her bag one morning in the early summer of 1878 and written this letter and wrapped the coins in the letter in Daniel's lucky stone and oilskin, and placed the package beneath the hearthstone with a care that matched the care Samuel had used to build the hearth itself. She wrote, "Samuel and I kept our accounts carefully. Every dollar in this package was earned by honest work and recorded in my household ledger. I gave that ledger to Jedediah Crane to keep when I left, because Jed is a man who understands that some things must be preserved even when there is no immediate use for them. If the ledger is ever needed, he will know where it is. She wrote, "To whoever finds this, I hope you are in need. I hope you are building a life here. Use this money to make this house a home again. Do not let it be a place of sorrow. Let it be a place of beginning. Look after what Samuel built. He built it to last. And please, if it is not too much to ask, take Daniel's stone down to the creek for him. Let it feel the water one more time. He loved that creek more than he loved anything except us." The letter ended there. No signature beyond the name at the top. The name was enough. Alara sat for a long time without moving after she finished reading. She held Daniel's stone in her left hand and the letter in her right, and she sat with everything that Esther Vance had placed in that hollow beneath the hearthstone, the money and the grief and the careful, desperate hope, and she felt the weight of it settle into her, the way good mortar settles into a joint, not filling the space so much as becoming part of the structure itself. She thought of Clara Voss, her own mother dead at 31, and of the book of poems that Alara carried in her canvas bag because it was the only physical thing that still held her mother's particular presence. She understood with the clarity that comes from having lived through your own version of a thing exactly what Esther Vance had been doing when she placed that package beneath the stone. She had not been hiding money. She had been making a promise to a future she could not see, trusting that the right person would eventually arrive to receive it. Alara folded the letter carefully along its original folds and held it for a moment against her chest. Then she made her own promise to the empty room and the stone walls and the dust motes turning in the afternoon light. She said it aloud because saying it aloud made it real in a way that thinking it could not. "I will not let it be a place of sorrow," she said. "I will build something here." The next morning she went to find Jedediah Crane. Augusta Fitch had mentioned him in passing when Alara had asked about stonemasons in the valley. She had said his name with a particular emphasis on the word "knew" when she mentioned that he had known Samuel Vance, the emphasis that signals relevant information without explaining exactly how. The North Fork Road climbed steeply from the settlement following a secondary creek up into a narrower canyon where the pines grew dense and the rock walls rose on both sides. She found Crane's place after an hour of walking, a small, well-kept homestead with a stone foundation so level and so precisely jointed that she stopped on the road to study it before she looked for the man himself. The foundation was old, but it had not moved. It sat in the earth with the quiet authority of work done properly at the beginning, so it would not need to be redone later. He was in his yard working on a dry stack retaining wall that edged his kitchen garden. He was 70 years old, or near enough a man made entirely of the materials he worked with, broad and gray and solid with hands that looked as though they had been shaped by the same geological forces that had shaped the stones he set. He looked up when she came through the gate. He did not say anything. She told him about the cabin and about the Hearthstone. She did not yet tell him about the letter or the package. She said only that she needed help assessing the damage and deciding on a repair approach. He looked at her for a moment with the assessing patience of someone who has learned that the first thing a person says is rarely the whole story, and that waiting will usually produce the rest. Then he said, "I knew Samuel Vance. He was a better mason than I am. I will come look at his work." He arrived at the cabin the following morning before she had finished her breakfast fire outside. He went directly to the hearth and crouched down in front of it without speaking, pressing one hand along the base of the arch the way a doctor takes a pulse, feeling for what the stone remembered. He tested 3 joints with his thumbnail. He pressed his thumb into the mortar at the keystone and held it there, reading something in the resistance that Alara could see in the slight change of his expression. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Good work. The fracture is in the stone, not in the setting. The rest will hold." It was the same assessment she had made herself, but hearing it from Jedediah Crane, who had known the man who built it, made it mean something different. She told him about the letter then. She showed it to him and watched him read it with the same patient attention he had given to the Hearthstone. She told him about the coins and about Daniel's stone. She showed him the small dark stone still sitting on the threshold where she had set it. He read the letter twice. Then he folded it very carefully along the original folds and handed it back to her without a word. He sat down heavily on the stool she had built and was quiet for a long time looking at the hollow where the package had been. When he finally spoke, he said, "Samuel told me before he died." He didn't say exactly what or exactly where. He said, "Jed, there is something beneath the heart of the house set there for the right person. He made me promise not to go looking for it. He said the right person would find it when the time was right." Alara looked at him. "You knew something was there. For 10 years, Matsumas." "I kept my promise," Crane said. He said it simply, without defensiveness, the way a man states a fact about himself that he has made his peace with. She understood then what kind of patience that required, and she recognized it because it was the same kind of patience Silas Holt had demonstrated every day in his workshop for 10 years. The patience of someone who trusts the process more than they trust their own impatience. They worked together on the hearth for 4 days. Crane confirmed that the cracked hearthstone was beyond repair, the fracture too deep and the settlement too uneven, and they decided together to replace it with 3 smaller stones selected from the creek bed for flatness and density. He showed her how to choose them, running his hand over each candidate with his eyes half closed, feeling for the qualities that could not be seen. He showed her how to mix the lime mortar with the feel she already mostly had from Silas, and where her technique needed refinement, he showed her by doing it beside her. Not by correcting her, but by demonstrating the difference until she could feel it herself. They worked side by side and said very little, communicating primarily through the work itself, and Alara found this deeply familiar. She had been raised in this language, the language of demonstrated knowledge, the language of shared attention to a difficult task done properly. She understood that she had been raised in a tradition that now had a name for her because she could see it from both sides, having received it from Silas and now receiving it again from Jedediah Crane. On the last day, when the final joint was tooled and the new hearthstone was level and solid and the mortar had cured to the right color, Crane stood back and looked at it for a long time. "Good," he said. She recognized the word for what it was. She used some of the gold coins to buy the materials the cabin still needed: cedar shingles for the roof sections that were failing more lime, a proper saw, a set of chisels, a draw knife, a good wool blanket, and a proper cooking pot. She bought seeds for a late cold frame garden. She spent the money as Esther had directed on the house, on the making of a home, and each purchase felt like a fulfillment of an obligation to someone she had never met, but who felt in a way she could not precisely articulate, like the family she had not had. She was splitting firewood behind the cabin on an afternoon in mid-October when she heard voices on the path and came around to find 3 men from the settlement at the edge of the clearing. She recognized Aldous Pruitt, who ran the tack shop. The other 2 she had seen but not spoken to. Pruitt was turning his hat in his hands in the way people do when they are about to say something they have been rehearsing. "Miss Voss," he said, "we heard some talk." "What talk?" she asked. "About you finding something in the cabin. Gold, people are saying." He paused. "Harlan Dodd is saying it. He's been saying it since yesterday morning. He's saying that treasure found in the ground belongs to the county, not to the person who finds it, and that you've been concealing something that's not yours to keep." Alara was very still. "He says he's going to petition the sheriff," one of the other men said, not unkindly, but with the caution of someone who has watched what happens to people who get between Harlan Dodd and something he wants. "Says the law is on his side." She thanked them. They left. She stood in the clearing for a long time after they had gone. She did not know whether Dodd's legal claim had any merit. She suspected it did not, because the money was not treasure in the legal sense. It was not abandoned property of unknown ownership. It was the documented personal savings of a known individual, preserved with explicit written instructions for its use, accompanied by a complete household ledger that recorded every dollar of its accumulation. But she also knew that in a county where Harlan Dodd had relationships with the sheriff and the local judiciary, the legal merits of a claim were not always the decisive factor. She went inside and reread Esther's letter by the light of the first fire she had lit in the new hearth, which burned clean and even, and threw its warmth into the room with the deep, sustained heat of properly chosen stone. She read it slowly, looking for every detail, reading it the way she had learned to read a piece of wood, looking for everything that was there, rather than just what she expected to find. She found the line about the ledger. She had read past it twice before. Esther had written it with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who understood that records were a form of protection. Samuel and I kept our accounts carefully. Every dollar in this package was earned by honest work and recorded in my household ledger. I gave that ledger to Jedediah Crane to keep when I left. Alara set the letter down. The next morning, she walked up the North Fork Road before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. She found Crane in his workshop sharpening chisels. He looked up when she came in, read something in her face, and set down the whetstone. She told him about Dodd and about what the men had said. She told him what she had found in the letter about the household ledger. He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the back of the workshop and opened a wooden chest, one of several, all of them neatly made, all of them locked. He sorted through the contents with the unhurrying patience that characterized everything he did, and after a few minutes he produced a small cloth-covered book. He held it out to her. She opened it. Esther Vance's handwriting covered the pages in columns of dates and amounts and brief descriptions. 6 years of household accounts, every dollar of the butter and eggs, and preserved goods, and occasional paid labor recorded with the precision of someone who had understood that the record itself was a form of security. "She asked you to keep this," Alara said. "She asked me to keep it until it was needed," he said. "I believed it would be needed eventually. I did not know when." "It's needed now," she said. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, the nod she had seen him give to a well-fitted stone. She took the ledger directly to Fitch's store and laid it in Esther's letter on the counter in front of Cornelius Fitch and told him what Dodd had been saying around the valley. Fitch picked up the ledger. He turned the pages slowly with the careful attention of a man who has dealt in legal documents long enough to understand the difference between evidence and assertion. He read several entries. He set the ledger down and looked at Alara over his spectacles. "This is a complete household account," he said. 6 years of recorded income. This is not treasure trove. Treasure trove is abandoned property of unknown ownership. This is a family's savings clearly documented, left with specific written instructions for its disposition. Dodd's claim has no basis in law." "Will the sheriff understand that?" Alara asked. Fitch looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man being honest within careful limits. "The sheriff of this county understands what Harlan Dodd explains to him," he said. "The district judge is a different matter. The district judge is in Creed, and Dodd has no influence in Creed." That same afternoon, Mabel Grissom appeared at the cabin. She was a woman of solid build and direct manner, the wife of a farmer who worked the flat bottomland at the south end of the valley. She arrived without ceremony, carrying a basket that contained a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, a jar of apple butter, and a wedge of hard cheese. She set the basket on the table Alara had built and looked around the cabin with the assessing eye of someone who knows what a rebuilt cabin looks like and can tell whether the work was done by someone who knew what they were doing. "I heard what Dodd is saying," Mabel said. "I wanted you to know that not everyone in this valley thinks as he does." It was the first time anyone in Whisper Creek had said anything to Alara that was neither a warning nor a transaction. She felt the warmth of it, the way she felt the warmth of the new hearth, as something she had not known she was waiting for until it arrived. "Thank you," she said. Mabel sat down on one of the stools with the ease of someone who has decided that the situation makes formality irrelevant. She looked at the hearthstones and the freshly chinked walls and the furniture that had been made by someone who knew how joinery worked. "Samuel Vance built that arch," she said quietly, looking at the firebox. "I remember when it was new. He was the most careful man I ever saw work stone." She looked at the new hearthstones. "Crane set those, you can tell." They sat for a while in the warmth of the cabin, the fire going steadily, and Mabel talked about the valley and about the families who had been there for a long time, and about what it had been like before Dodd had started accumulating everything that came available and making it clear to people that there were consequences for not accommodating him. When Mabel stood to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at the cabin, at all of it. "Esther Vance would be glad," she said. She left, and Alara sat alone in the cabin that was becoming a home and held Daniel's stone in her hand and thought about what came next. The district judge in Creed was named Harmon Elias Whitcomb, and he had been on the bench for 22 years, long enough to have seen every variety of land dispute and financial manipulation that the Colorado mountains could produce, and long enough to have developed a comprehensive contempt for men who used legal instruments the way a bully uses a larger boy's arm to hit him with his own hand. Fitch wrote to him on Alar's behalf a careful letter that included a summary of the household ledger and a description of the letter Esther Vance had left beneath the hearthstone, and Whitcomb wrote back within 2 weeks with a response that Fitch read to Alara across his counter with the measured satisfaction of a man delivering news he has been looking forward to delivering. The judge's letter stated that the property in question did not meet the legal definition of treasure trove under Colorado territorial law, which required that the property be of unknown ownership and abandoned without intent of recovery. The Vance savings were documented, owned, and left with explicit written instructions for their disposition. The petition filed by Harlan Dodd's attorney was without merit and was dismissed. Any further petitions on the same grounds would be treated as frivolous and subject to cost sanctions. Fitch folded the letter and set it on the counter. That, he said, is what the law looks like when it works correctly. Alara took the letter and folded it into her coat alongside the deed and Esther's letter, the growing document of her life in this valley. She thanked Fitch. She walked back up the path to the cabin in the cold, clear air of late October, the first hard frost still white on the shadowed grass, where the sun had not yet reached the smoke from her morning fire, rising straight up into the windless sky. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin before she went in. The walls were tight, the door hung true. The roof had been patched in every place she had found weakness, the new cedar shingles pale against the weathered gray of the old ones. Inside, the hearth burned with the steady, deep heat of well-chosen stone, and the furniture she had built stood solid on the packed earth floor, and the shelf beside the fireplace held her few possessions, arranged with the unconscious care of someone who understands that a space reflects the attention given to it. She had done this. With $12 in a canvas bag and the knowledge Silas Holt had given her over 10 years of patient wordless teaching, she had taken a ruin that a calculating man had spent a decade keeping empty, and she had made it into a place where a person could live and be warm and be held by walls that had been built to last. She went inside and made her coffee and sat by the fire and let herself feel quietly and without ceremony that she had won something. Not everything. Dodd was not finished. She knew this the way you know the difference between a storm that has passed and a storm that has only paused. But the judge's letter was real, and the deed was real, and the cabin was real. And those three things together constituted a foundation, and a foundation, as Silas had shown her, was the thing everything else was built on. Dodd's response to the judge's letter was 10 days of silence. She had learned to be suspicious of his silences. He had not built his position in this valley through confrontation. He had built it through patience and indirection, and the particular intelligence that specializes in finding the small, leverageable weakness in any structure, the loose stone, the soft joint, the existing crack that needs only a small, precise application of force to become a failure. She had watched him work not directly, but through the accounts of people she spoke with, and she had built a picture of him that she thought was accurate. He was not a man who lost gracefully. He was a man who changed his approach. The silence broke on a Thursday morning when Fitch sent his hired boy up the path with a note. The note said only, "Come see me when you can." The careful neutrality of "when you can," rather than "as soon as you're able," told her Fitch was managing something he did not want to alarm her about prematurely. She went that afternoon. Fitch was alone in the store with the front door locked and the closed sign in the window, which was unusual enough that she stood outside for a moment before knocking at the side entrance. He let her in and led her to the back room where he kept the accounts, and he sat down across the table from her and put his hands flat on the surface in the way of someone about to say something they have thought about carefully. "Dodd has found a different avenue," Fitch said. He explained it slowly. When the county had originally recorded the Vance deed in 1872, The recording fee had been $3 payable within 1 year of registration. Samuel Vance had paid $2.75 documented in the county record, and the remaining 25 cents had been carried forward as an outstanding balance. In 1879, the county had assessed a clerical penalty on all outstanding deed fees, adding an administrative charge that brought the total outstanding balance on the Vance deed to $3.12. The balance had sat in the county ledger for 9 years, essentially forgotten. Dodd had found it. He had paid the outstanding balance himself at the county seat and obtained a certificate of debt assumption, a legal instrument that allowed a creditor who had satisfied another party's debt to recover the amount from the debtor. The debt was trivial. The mechanism Dodd intended to use it for was not. His attorney had filed a motion arguing that the outstanding fee constituted a lien on the property title that had not been satisfied at the time of the $12 deed transfer, and that the transfer was therefore incomplete. The $3 Dodd had paid his attorney argued gave him a superior claim to the property until the lien was fully and legally resolved, which his attorney intended to make as prolonged and expensive as possible. Fitch looked at Alara across the table with the expression of someone who has seen this specific maneuver before. "It is not a strong legal argument," he said. "The judge in Creed would almost certainly dismiss it. But to get it to the judge in Creed, you would need to file a response which requires an attorney, which requires money. Dodd knows you don't have much left after the materials you bought." She had perhaps $30 remaining from Esther's savings. An attorney at the county seat would cost more than that for a single consultation. "How long do I have?" she asked. "The motion is returnable in 30 days, Fitch said. "If you don't respond, the motion carries by default." She thanked him and walked back to the cabin. That evening, she sat by the fire and looked at the flames for a long time without doing anything else. The hearth that Samuel Vance had built, repaired now by Jedediah Crane, and by her own hands, threw its warmth into the room with the steady, generous heat of stone that has been properly set and properly tended. On the shelf beside the fireplace sat the applewood knife, and beside it Daniel's stone, and the two objects together had come to feel like company of a particular and reliable kind. She was not afraid. She was something more useful than afraid, which was clear-sighted. She could see the situation exactly as it was, without the distortion of panic or the false comfort of minimizing it. Dodd had found a lever that was technically legal and practically effective, and she had 30 days and insufficient funds for an attorney, and the judge who had ruled in her favor was 60 miles away in Creed. She picked up Daniel's stone from the shelf and turned it in her fingers. The smooth, dark surface, the perfect weight of it, and thought about Esther Vance placing it in that oilskin package with the coins and the letter. She thought about what it meant to preserve something for a future you cannot see, to trust that the right circumstances will eventually arise, to refuse to let loss become the final word on a place you had loved. She made her decision. She would not wait for the 30 days to run down hoping for a resolution she could not produce alone. She would go to the community, not to ask for charity. She was certain about that distinction. She would tell the truth about what Dodd had been doing not only to her, but to this valley for 15 years. She would lay it out plainly, each piece in its place, the way you lay out a course of stone. What the people of Whisper Creek chose to do with that information was their own decision. She would not make it for them. She started with Mabel Grissom. She walked to the Grissom farm on a Friday morning and found Mabel in her yard, hanging washing on a line strung between two pines. Mabel looked up when Alara came through the gate, read something in her face, and unpinned the shirt she was holding, and gave Alara her full attention without being asked. Alara told her everything. The outstanding fee and the lien and the attorney's motion and the 30-day window and the money she did not have. She told it plainly without self-pity or performance. When she was done, she said, "I am not asking you for anything. I want you to know what is happening." Mabel was quiet for a moment, the washing forgotten in the basket at her feet. She had a face that had been shaped by a lifetime of considering things carefully before speaking, and the considering was visible now. "How much is the lien?" Mabel asked. $3.12, Alara said. Something moved across Mabel Grissom's face. Not quite anger, though it contained anger. The expression of someone who has been watching a particular injustice accumulate for a long time and has arrived at the point where patience is no longer appropriate. $3, Mabel said quietly. She said it in the tone of a woman who has measured a thing and found it profoundly wanting. She thanked Alara for coming and told her to go back to the cabin and wait. Her voice had acquired a quality Alara had not heard in it before, a quiet decisiveness that felt like the closing of a hand around the right tool. What happened next, Alara learned afterward in pieces through the accounts of people who had been there, and through the gaps in those accounts, which were sometimes as informative as the accounts themselves. Mabel Grissom spent that Friday afternoon going door to door through the settlement, choosing her doors with the precision of someone who knows their community well enough to know who will act and who will only talk and who will do both, which is the most useful combination. She went to the Prescott house. She went to Aldous Pruitt. She went to the Kerrigan family at the sawmill, who had their own history with Dodd involving a timber rights dispute resolved in Dodd's favor through the kind of resolution that leaves a permanent residue of understanding about who holds power in a given place. She went to Jedediah Crane. He came down from the North Fork on horseback before the day was done. Alara did not know any of this until Saturday morning, when she opened the cabin door at first light and found a small envelope on the threshold, held down by a stone so the night wind had not taken it. Inside the envelope were coins. She counted them on the table by the morning light coming through the window. She had reframed herself, the window she had fitted with glass bought with money earned from mending. The coins amounted to $3.20. There was no note. There was no name. Only the coins in the envelope left in the night by someone who had not wanted to be thanked, or perhaps by several someones who had agreed together that the anonymity was the point. She sat at the table for a long time with the coins in front of her. She had expected when Mabel had said, "Wait," that something would happen, but she had not known what. She had not expected this. She did not know what to do with the feeling it produced in her, which was unlike anything she had felt before, which required language she did not yet have. It was the feeling of having been seen, not by one person, by many. Not through grand generosity, but through the specific, deliberate act of paying a debt that was not theirs to pay because they had decided together that it should not stand. She thought about the difference between a community and a collection of people who happened to live near each other. She thought she was finally beginning to understand it. She went to Fitch that morning and paid the lien. $3.12 placed on the counter with the same deliberateness with which she had placed $12 on that same counter in September. Fitch filed the receipt with the county record by the afternoon post. Dodd's attorney's motion, when it came before the district court the following month, was mooted by the payment and dismissed without a hearing. When the news of the dismissal reached Whisper Creek, it moved through the settlement the way news moves in small communities, quickly and unevenly. Dodd heard it through his own channels. He did not come to the cabin. He did not send anyone. He did not appear at Fitch's store for 3 days, and when he did appear, those present said his manner was different. The expansive deliberateness of a man accustomed to occupying any room he entered, replaced by something tighter. The manner of someone who has revised his assessment of a situation and is still working through what the revision means. The valley watched him with a new kind of attention. There is a particular attention that a small community pays to a man who has been revealed not through any single dramatic exposure, but through accumulation, through the slow recognition that the small decisions people had individually accommodated, each one seeming isolated and survivable, described together a pattern as clear as a course of stonework to anyone willing to look at the whole structure. People who had made their peace with Dodd's way of operating began to compare the terms of their peace. The comparison was not comfortable. Alara was not party to most of this. She was at the cabin. There was still work to be done before winter fully settled in the mountains, and she applied herself to it with the same methodical patience she had brought to every task since September. She finished the roof repairs. She built a small cold storage alcove into the north side of the cabin, set against the stone foundation where the ground stayed consistently cool, sealed with a tight-fitting pine door of her own design. She extended the firewood stack along the south wall until it reached the corner enough for well past the deepest part of winter. She was splitting the last of a large pine section on an afternoon in early November, the axe falling in the slow, certain rhythm of someone who has found the right pace for a task, when she heard hoofbeats on the path and looked up to find Jedediah Crane coming through the trees. He dismounted at the edge of the clearing and tied his horse to a pine and came across the clearing with something under his arm, a flat object wrapped in cloth. She set down the axe and waited. He stopped a few feet from her and held the cloth-wrapped thing out without preamble. She took it. It was stiff the way old photographs are stiff, the paper backing rigid with age. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a photograph. She had seen photographs before the formal portraits kept in parlors and brought out on significant occasions stiff and self-conscious. This one was not formal. It had been taken outdoors in summer light in front of a structure that she recognized with a shock that moved through her entire body before her mind had time to catch up. Her cabin. The stone walls she had been living inside for 2 months, but knew in this photograph, the stones pale and the mortar joints fresh, and the sod roof still holding its summer green. The door opened behind the two men who stood in front of it. The clearing properly cleared the vegetable garden visible at the far edge. The two men were young, mid-30s perhaps. Both of them were grinning at whoever held the camera, the easy grin of men who are pleased with something they have just made. One of them, she did not know, solid and compact, with the broad hands of a stonemason, visible even at this scale, standing with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in their own physical competence. This would be Samuel Vance, the other man she knew. Older now, much older, but the same in the essential ways. The same long jaw, the same quality of careful attention, visible even in a grin, even in the relaxed posture of a man who has just finished something he is proud of. She would have known him anywhere. She had known him from 9 years old, had sat in his workshop and learned everything she knew about wood and stone and the patient application of skill to resistant material. Silas Holt. He was standing in front of the cabin he and Samuel Vance had built together in the summer of 1872, 16 years ago, 4 years before Laura was born. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at the two men grinning in front of the stone walls, young and satisfied, and entirely unaware of everything that would happen next. And she felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but contained both the feeling of a thing settling into its proper place after a long time of not quite fitting anywhere. Crane sat down on the chopping block and let her look for as long as she needed to. When she finally spoke, she said, "He knew." "He knew," Crane said. "When he taught me. The stone, the mortar, the lime mix, the joinery. He taught you everything, Samuel, and he figured out together building this place," Crane said. He said it with the simplicity of someone who has known something for a long time and has been waiting for the right moment to say it. He talked about Samuel often after. He talked about this cabin. He said Samuel had built the best hearth he'd ever seen. He paused. When Esther left and the place went empty, Silas grieved it. He used to say the right person will come. When they're ready, they'll come. Alara thought about the morning she had left Harwick, standing at the door of Silas's workshop with her canvas bag and the old man setting down his plane and turning to face her. The nod he had given her. She had understood it at the time as acknowledgement, as recognition, as the compressed emotional vocabulary of a man who did not have many words for what he felt most deeply. She understood now that it had been something more specific. He had known where she was going, or had understood in the way that people who have thought carefully about something for a very long time sometimes understand the shape of what is coming before it arrives. He had spent 10 years teaching her every skill she would need for this specific house, and he had given her a knife shaped to her hand. And when she stood at his door with her bag, he had looked at her and nodded, because she was finally ready to go where she had, in some sense that he had understood long before she did always been heading. Not by his design, not by anyone's design, but by the accumulation of small, careful decisions, his and Samuel's and Esther's and her own, that had shaped a path the way water shapes a channel, not by force, but by the patient, persistent work of years. She sat down on the ground in front of Crane and held the photograph in both hands and let herself feel the full weight of it, the full improbable thread that ran from Samuel Vance, choosing stones from this creek bed in 1872, to Alara Voss lifting the Hearthstone in 1888 from Silas Holt, placing a block of pine and a knife on a stump inside his workshop door, to a girl who had come here with $12 and the knowledge of how to use them. She thought about Esther's phrase from the letter, the right person would find it when the time was right. She had thought when she first read it that Esther meant the money. She understood now that Esther had meant something larger than the money, or had meant the money as one part of something that could not be named all at once. The whole accumulated inheritance of love and skill and careful preparation that had been waiting patient as stone for someone capable of receiving it and carrying it forward. "He's still alive?" she asked. She meant Silas. She needed to hear the answer before she could fully hold what the photograph meant. "As of last spring," Crane said, "I had a letter from a man in Harwick who knows me through the Masons Exchange. He said Silas was well, slower but working." She nodded. She folded the cloth carefully back around the photograph. "Keep it," Crane said. "It belongs here." She placed it on the shelf beside the fireplace when she went inside that evening, beside the applewood knife and beside Daniel's stone. The three objects together made something she did not have a precise word for, but that felt complete in the way that a well-fitted joint feels complete, in the way that a room that has been properly tended feels complete, in the way that a life that has found its right material and right use feels complete. The news about Dodd came on a Wednesday in mid-November, carried by a traveling supply merchant on his circuit between the county seat and the High Valley communities. He had been at the county seat courthouse the week before and described what he had witnessed to Fitch and Augusta and the others present with the relish of a man who has been waiting to tell a particular story to exactly the right audience. Harlan Dodd had gone to the county seat in late October to sell a package of land deeds, 15 parcels accumulated over 12 years throughout the county, the portfolio of a man converting held assets to cash. He had engaged a title company to prepare the transfer documentation. The title company, in the course of its standard examination, had found irregularities in 3 of the deeds. Signatures that did not match the recorded marks of the sellers. Acknowledgement dates that preceded the actual recording dates by intervals. Not legally permissible. Notarial seals from a notary who had died 18 months before the documents were purportedly certified. The title company had declined to proceed and had notified the county clerk. The county clerk had notified the district attorney. The district attorney had requested an examination of the entire portfolio. By the time the supply merchant had left the county seat, Dodd had retained a criminal defense attorney and was not attending to his ranching interests. Fitch shared the account with Alara when she came into the store 2 days later. She read the letter standing at the counter, then read it again, then folded it and gave it back. She walked back up the path to the cabin in the November cold, the light low and slanted through the bare aspens, and she thought about what Silas had shown her about structural failure, how it is almost never the final load that causes the collapse, but the weaknesses that have been accumulating quietly for years, each one consuming a little more of the margin that was supposed to provide safety until the structure meets a load that the healthy version of itself could have handled easily and the compromised version cannot. The load reveals the failure, but the failure was always already there. Dodd had been building his structure on flawed joints for 15 years. She had not brought it down. It had been in the process of falling long before she arrived in this valley. She had only declined to be buried when it fell. She felt no triumph walking back to the cabin. She felt something quieter than triumph, which was the particular satisfaction of a person who has done the work that was in front of them and watched the larger situation resolve itself in the way that larger situations sometimes do when you stop trying to force them and attend instead to the small work you can actually do well. November deepened toward December. The valley changed the way high mountain valleys change in winter, not gradually, but in a series of decisive transformations, each more absolute than the last. The aspens had long since dropped their leaves, their white trunks standing bare and precise against the dark pines. The creek ran lower and spoke differently, the summer urgency replaced by the careful movement of water that is beginning to feel the approach of ice. The peaks above the valley wore permanent snow now, and the mornings came in hard and bright, the frost on the grass not melting until nearly noon. The first snow of winter arrived on a Saturday in early December, coming in the night with the characteristic silence of mountain snowfall. Alara woke to a world transformed without announcement. She lay in the loft for a moment and listened to the silence, which was different from ordinary silence, denser and more complete. The silence of a world that has been thoroughly insulated, and she felt the warmth rising from the hearth below through the floorboards. She dressed and climbed down and stirred the fire back to life, and stood at the window she had reframed with her own hands and watched the snow in the clearing. The woodpile was a long white mound. The garden beds she had cleared and prepared for winter were smooth white rectangles. The path to the settlement was unbroken, its surface continuous with the clearing, its presence known only to her because she knew where to look. The pines at the clearing's edge wore their loads of new snow with the patience of things that have been through this particular transformation 10,000 times and expect to go through it 10,000 times more. The cabin was warm. She made coffee and sat by the fire and looked at the shelf. The photograph, the knife, the stone. Three objects that between them contained an entire education in what mattered and what lasted, what a person could carry, and what had to be built in place, what could be given, and what had to be earned. She had come to this valley with a knife and $12 and the invisible, weightless inheritance of 10 years of wordless teaching. And she had found here the other half of that inheritance, the half that had been waiting in the stone and in the carefully preserved accounts, and in the careful silence of a man who had kept a promise for 10 years because Samuel Vance had asked him to. Mabel Grissom came in the afternoon plowing through the new snow with the purposeful energy of a woman who has decided that weather is a condition to be managed rather than an obstacle to be avoided. She brought bread and the three Kerrigan children, who were 9 and 7 and 5, and who had apparently concluded that the snow constituted a community emergency requiring a collective response. The children built a structure of debatable architectural merit in the clearing, while the women sat by the fire and drank coffee, and the cabin was full of small voices and the smell of fresh bread and the deep, steady heat of the hearth that Samuel had built and that Alara and Crane had repaired. Jedediah Crane arrived as the afternoon light was failing, having come down from the North Fork in the snow, because he said without further explanation he had thought he would. He sat by the fire with his large hands wrapped around a mug of coffee and said very little, which was what he always did, and which Alara had come to understand was not absence but a particular kind of presence, the presence of someone who is entirely in the room without needing to announce it. She waited until the children had come inside from the cold and settled near the fire with the instinctive competence of children who know how to make themselves comfortable in an adult space. And then she put on her coat and her boots and went outside. The snow had stopped and the sky had cleared the way mountain skies clear. After a storm, suddenly and completely, the stars appearing all at once in their full winter intensity. She stood in the clearing and looked up at them and thought about her mother's voice naming them from the back porch of the house in Harwick, a warm voice on a summer night naming Orion and the Pleiades and the great river of the Milky Way pouring across the dark. She looked up and found them. She could still name them all. She went to the shelf and took Daniel's stone. She carried it outside and walked down the path to the creek in the new snow. Her footsteps the first marks on the smooth white surface, each one deliberate and clear. She crouched at the water's edge where the creek ran clear and cold over its bed of stones, the same stones that Samuel Vance had read for their qualities and selected for his walls, the same water that a boy named Daniel had loved and spent his days beside his pockets, full of the things this valley offered to a child who was paying attention. She held the stone in the current. The cold was immediate and absolute. The water was clear enough that she could see every detail of her hand and the stone resting in her palm, the dark surface of it, the particular smoothness that only comes from years of water moving over a thing with patient consistency. She held it there and felt the water moving over it and did not say anything aloud. She sent her message through the cold and the current, through the stone that had traveled from a child's pocket to his mother's careful hands, to an oilskin package beneath a hearthstone, to the palm of a girl who had come here with nothing except what she needed to receive everything that was waiting. She held it for a long time. Then she brought it out of the water and held it in both hands for a moment, the cold radiating from it before she dried it carefully on her coat and carried it back to the cabin and set it on the shelf where it sat between the photograph and the knife. Dark and smooth and wet from the creek that Daniel Vance had loved, the lucky stone that had waited 10 years in the dark beneath a hearthstone for someone who would know what to do with it. Inside the cabin, the fire was burning, and the voices of the people she had come to know were audible through the plank door, Mabel's steady warmth, and Crane's deliberate quiet, and the children's smaller voices overlapping in the way children's voices do when they feel safe and attended to. The sounds of a winter evening in a room that had been built to last by a man who believed that a thing built well enough lasts forever. She stood on the threshold for a moment before she went inside. She looked at the clearing, white and still under the enormous sky. She looked at the stone walls that Samuel Vance had built, with hands that understood exactly what they were doing. Walls that had stood through 10 winters of neglect, and were still standing walls that she had learned to read and tend and repair with skills given to her by the oldest friend of the man who built them. She looked at the door that hung true on hinges she had made herself, the window she had reframed with wood she had selected, and cut herself the roof she had patched shingle by shingle against the coming of this exact snow. She thought about Silas Holt in his workshop in Harwick, his hands moving over wood with the slow, certain grace of a man who has made his peace with time and with the limits of what any single person can build and pass on. She thought about Esther Vance wherever she had gone, whatever life she had made in the place where the memories were not in every stone and every gust of wind. She thought about what it means to leave something behind for a future you cannot see, to trust the right person with the right inheritance, without being able to know who they will be or when they will arrive, or whether what you have left them will be enough. It had been enough. She was 19 years old. She was in a place she had bought with the last money she had, a place that everyone had said was cursed, a place that had been waiting for her since before she was born, in ways that she could not have understood until she arrived and did the work of arriving completely. She had rebuilt its door and reframed its window and repaired its walls and restored its hearth and chinked its gaps and patched its roof and stocked its woodpile and built its furniture and made it warm. And she had been seen doing it, and she had not left. She went inside. The door closed behind her, solid and true on its hinges, shutting out the cold, with the clean finality of something made to last, fitted together with the care of someone who understood that the work you put into a thing at the beginning is the work that holds it up through everything that comes after. The fire burned in the hearth that Samuel Vance had built with his best craft, and that Alara Voss had repaired with everything Silas Holt had taught her. The stone walls held the heat, the roof held the snow. The people inside held each other in the way that people hold each other when they have decided without making a ceremony of the decision that this is the place, and these are the people, and this is the life they are going to build. On the shelf beside the hearth, the photograph stood between the knife and the stone. 3 objects, a thread connecting 1872 to 1888 to whatever came next. A record of what had been trusted to the right person and what the right person had done with it. In the clearing outside, the snow held every footprint she had made coming and going. The record of a person who had arrived with nothing and learned that the nothing she had arrived with was in fact everything she needed. The creek moved through the winter dark below the clearing, cold and clear and indifferent and entirely faithful, carrying the same water over the same stones that Daniel Vance had loved when he was 8 years old and the world was new. It had always been enough. It had only been waiting for someone who knew how to receive it.